Good afternoon. Such a pleasure to be back here on stage. And I'm delighted to open this panel with a dear friend, Jared Cohen. He's the global president of the Goldman Sachs of International Affairs. But more importantly, we have been friends for many years. He's an expert in technology, geopolitics, among many things. And Jared, you've devoted a lot of your time to analyze the trends in technology, the evolution of AI. And there's the idea that AI will be the greatest opportunity for many countries, but there's also the possibility that AI can be a nightmare for others. How do you think we could judge AI from a geopolitical perspective? Is it AI or III?
So first of all, it's great to be here. I can't think of a better person to do this with than President Duque. We've been friends for 20 years, and before I answer his question, I should just tell the group that we have here, I may have learned one of my most valuable lessons in my professional career from President Duque, which is if you just surround yourself with the smartest and most interesting people, eventually they become president. We got to know each other when he was an advisor to President Uribe 2 decades ago, and he eventually became president, and we spent a lot of time together during those years just because I found him incredibly fascinating. So to your question about AI, there's a lot of known unknowns about AI. Will open models win out over closed models? Positive use cases versus illiberal use cases? Who will win the various AI races? I think a useful place to start, because we've seen many different technological eras and chapters, is what is actually new? Is there anything about the AI revolution today that is unique to history? And I would posit that most of the time, we're seeing just new manifestations of things that have played out in history before. But when it comes to this particular chapter of AI, there's something ahistoric and unique. And it's not the cliche things of more money ever spent, more data accumulated, faster company growth. All of that you could argue is part of the cumulative evolution of technology. What's unique about AI is if you look at the internet, we're revisionist about the evolution of the internet, and we treat it as if it all came onto the scene abruptly all at once. And the reality is the US had a 3-decade first mover advantage. It did not have a peer competitor, and the internet became ubiquitous over the course of many years and decades. What's unique particularly about generative AI and large language models, it's the most significant technology the world has ever known that the entire world found out about at the exact same time. On November 30th, 2022, OpenAI released its public web interface for ChatGPT, and every country, every business, every person, from the most sophisticated engineer to my own mother, wealthy countries, not wealthy countries, technologically advanced countries, countries that are technologically behind, there was this moment of simultaneity, and it was simultaneity without parity. And so to get to your question about geopolitical implications, what's fascinating about this that's also quite new, usually when a new technology breaks out onto the scene, there's lots of skeptics. What's interesting about this is businesses and investors and people are pummeling money into AI infrastructure and AI development without really knowing what the use case is that will justify the spend. We're all assuming that that's going to happen. It likely will happen, but it's this sea of endorsement of a technology that everyone has decided provides a once-in-a-generation opportunity for geopolitical mobility, corporate mobility, and I think it's the fact that the technology is being innovated and created faster than the use cases are understood, which makes it so complicated when you talk about the double-edged sword problem, which is technology has both good use cases and also illiberal use cases.
If I were to connect that also with the other great geopolitical question that it's around, which is China versus the United States, and that includes also who's going to win the AI race, as many people have tried to put it. How do you think that that relationship is going to evolve? Yeah. And how do you think we can win the moment instead of trying to sell the prophecy of conflict in the future?
So this question of who's going to win the AI race, the US or China, I would say it's one of the 3 most common questions that I get asked by Goldman's clients around the world. And it's an interesting question because to me, it represents the convergence of 2 things that are unique in history. One, which I already mentioned around the simultaneity of generative AI. US had a 3-decade first mover advantage and didn't have China as a peer competitor. now the US and China are competing in the development of large language models as technology peers. But there's another factor that's new here, which is it's unprecedented in modern history for America's third largest trading partner to be its most formidable adversary. The US and the Soviet Union were never economically intertwined in the way that the US and China are at every level of the value chain. And the problem with that is, before COVID, you could count on the economic interests of both countries tempering the geopolitics when things would heat up. Ever since COVID, it's been the reverse, and you have domestic pressures in both the US and China driving short-term geopolitical thinking at the expense of medium and long-term economic consequences. And so the relationship between the US and China gets viewed through a zero-sum Cold War lens when it really has none of the attributes of the Cold War. Which brings me to the question, we sort of view this competition between the US and China on AI much the way we would view competition in the context of the Cold War. I don't think either the US or China is going to win the AI race. I think the answer is both the US and China, by competing with each other, are going to create a situation where they both win disproportionately. And the reason for that is, everyone focuses on the top of the technology stack, but if you look at the entire value chain, from the mid-tech manufacturing that goes into the data center to the high-end chips, it's all deeply intertwined. And it's the same value chain. It can't be easily reoriented. And so it begs an interesting question. If the US and China emerge from this disproportionately powerful in the AI context, with the US marching towards AGI with the development of frontier models and China focused more on consumer applications, what does that mean for the rest of the world? And how do the US and China try to create these AI spheres of influence in the rest of the world? And President Duque, you've seen this in many chapters, a very interesting question for Latin America. How will Latin America, which has had to do this delicate dance between the US and China on many different issues in many different supply chains, how are they going to think about whether or not they lean towards China, whether they lean towards the US? Because right now the context is not one that is allowing countries to play both sides.
Jared, you are also an author, and you've written books that have sold millions of copies. Two amazing books recently, Accidental Presidents and Life After Power. What lessons from history and the exercise of presidential power in circumstances that can be applicable to the times we face today would you invite heads of state to consider to seek the moment and to navigate the storms that we have right now of conflict, technology, but at the same time, uncertainty?
Well, you're correct that I like writing about history, and it is true. I traffic in writing about dead people, in part because you can take a really long time to write the book, and by the time you're done, they're still going to be dead. But part of it is, and it gets to the questions that I asked at the beginning about what's new, right? If you look at today's environment, it is very noisy geopolitically, probably the most uncertain geopolitical moment we've had in more than 2 decades. It's very noisy technologically, and the global markets are very noisy. And so cutting through all of that, people try to sort of forecast what's going to happen on Tuesday, what's going to happen on Thursday. I try to forecast what's going to happen by going backwards. Because people throw around, this is unprecedented, this is unique, this has never happened before. People talk about that in the context of our own political system in the US. The reality is most things that look unique have a precedent in history, and they may manifest themselves in a way that's unique. But that's important because if you look backwards and you can find a precedent, if you look backwards and you can find a case study, you can then use history to navigate the way forward. And the most effective presidents are the ones that look backwards in order to understand how we got to where we are today, and have that inform where we're going. The problem when you have 2 mega trends, geopolitically with the US and China, and technologically with generative AI, that are properly new and unique and distinct in history, is it creates so much uncertainty. You can't rely on history to guide you, and it means that there is just a proliferation of miscalculation. So the US and China, as the 2 biggest economies in the world, the 2 biggest militaries in the world, and the 2 biggest AI superpowers in the world, have gone completely off script in how they're navigating the international system. And the problem is so many other countries formulate their foreign policies and economic policies in ways that calibrate with what the US and China does. And so it sets off this cascading effect where everybody is gone off script and leads to this miscalculation. And so for presidents, the first stop is always looking at history. And the second stop is, if history is not a guide, you need a new framework, you need a new doctrine, you need a new thesis about how to navigate the world.
You've also written about the future of technology. And I recall that you wrote this incredible book with Eric Schmidt about technologies that are going to be disruptive, that happened some time ago. If you were to pick those technologies that you think are going to shape the way we behave and how societies work in the next 3 to 4 years, which ones would you pick?
So I would start with, I'll do something that is going to sound very arrogant, which is quote my own book, but I'm going to do it in service of disparaging my contributions to the intellectual discourse, because I think my answer to that is captured by a glaring omission when Eric Schmidt and I wrote our book. It came out in 2012. It's called The New Digital Age, and we were looking at this question of what happens when another 5 billion people connect to the internet and the internet becomes properly ubiquitous. And our thesis was, if we look at all of the problems of the physical world, they're all going to spill over online. And so if you want to understand what that's going to look at, start with the physical world and begin to imagine the digital manifestation of this. And we had a thesis that there's no such thing as cyberspace and there's no such thing as physical space. There's one international system and it has a digital front and a physical front. But we started off the book by saying the internet is the most important thing that human beings have built that they don't fully understand. And we described it as the greatest experiment in anarchy the world has ever seen. If you replace the internet with AI, I think you would have a much more relevant statement today, because the reality is the internet era was not anarchic. It could have been regulated. It could have been done in a way where governments came together and created the right guardrails. There just wasn't the collective will to do it. But in theory, if you look back, it could have been done. When I look at the current technological environment, I don't see a path to global multilateral regulation. There's just too much divergence in terms of what countries want to do. The proliferation of non-state actors, from businesses to individuals, add additional complexity. And the fact that the United States as a democratic society is investing in closed frontier models, and China as a state-led authoritarian system is investing in open source models, is creating also a bit of a complicated dynamic. And so AI is the obvious answer. I think the second answer is the reimagining of the payment rails, because we typically think about the internet as a way to connect people to information and also to each other. When you look at the way that people are trying to reimagine the payment rails, the technology is incredibly interesting, so it attracts really top-notch engineers. There's lots of sovereign incentives to capture more autonomy within the dollar economy, even if I don't think the dollar is going to cease to be the global reserve currency. And the ability for technology to move actual resources in real time is so integral and so key to how the world functions that top engineering and complex engineering plus real world challenges and sovereign incentives makes that a space that's likely to continue to be interesting.
Jared, we still have a minute and a half, and I have to ask you about Global South. Because here in Concordia, in the last days, we've talked about Global North, but again, about the challenges in the Global South. What do you think the Global South should do in order not to lose momentum in this revolution? We came late in the Industrial Revolution. We came late in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We came late also when the Internet Revolution started. How can the Global South catch up?
So you'll recall I said that when you have something unique in history, it requires a different framework for making sense of it. So if you look at this unprecedented situation where the US and China are competing as each other's third largest trading partners, I think it makes the concept of the Global South a bit antiquated. Because what I see is there's a hierarchy that's developed within what we previously thought of as the Global South. And if you look at competition between the US and China, because it's not a Cold War, neither side is going to try to destroy the other in its entirety, because it would lead to mutual economic immolation. And there's just certain countries that both the US and China need. And the US and China can't compete against each other without relying on other countries. And so if you think about countries that have a differentiated part of the supply chain, an abundant amount of flexible capital that they can deploy as they see fit, they're attractive for nearshoring, offshoring, and friendshoring. They possess a lot of the ingredients that are necessary for the AI revolution. And most importantly, they're led by an individual that has a global agenda, independent of Washington and Beijing. These countries represent what I describe as the rise of geopolitical swing states. They're not blocking together like a non-aligned movement. They have this economic wherewithal that they can take advantage of and exploit the competition that exists between the US and China. And while those countries aren't going to control the table, they're very powerful pieces on the geopolitical chessboard. For both the US and China, you're going to see them courting those countries. So for geopolitical swing states, maximizing their flexibility is how they achieve a once-in-a-generation opportunity for geopolitical and economic mobility. You see this with India by staying neutral in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But for the rest of the countries that you wouldn't sort of classify as geopolitical swing states, it also gets very interesting because while historically they've had one choice or another for how they align, they can increasingly diversify the ways that they align by also attaching themselves to some of these geopolitical swing states, particularly as it pertains to artificial intelligence.
And Jared, my last question. You're always an optimist, and I love when we always talk, you have an optimistic lens that turns out always to be realistic. What are the three main reasons why are you so optimistic now?
One reason I'm optimistic is what I describe as the story of dual innovation, which is if you look at every technology, it's a tale of two innovations. It's the people who build the technology to solve for one set of problems, and then the people who get access to technology that use those tools to solve for a totally different set of problems, right? So, necessity drives innovation, and it's usually the people who don't have the luxury of their countries being the epicenter of technological innovation that tell the rest of the world how to use it. So we still haven't seen the story of innovation in terms of use cases, which I think will come from the parts of the world that we were just talking about, not from Silicon Valley and not from Beijing. I'm also optimistic because when I look at AI, yes, good and bad use cases, anyone that's played around with these tools, it just irrefutably brings knowledge to the fingertips of any individual. Mobile phones are ubiquitous. As we move towards models being able to run on the edge and run on devices, bandwidth constraints won't become as much of an issue. It's not going to solve poverty. It's not going to solve education gaps, but it does contribute to leveling of the playing field. And then I think there's something incredibly optimistic about the entire world, from democratic to authoritarian countries, rich to poor countries, geographically diverse countries, all leaning into a single technological moment that they don't fully understand as the most significant thing that's happened since the internet.
Jared Cohen, thank you for being in Concordia. That was amazing, man. Congratulations.
Thank you.